it going, everybody? This is the Nitty Gritty. My name is Chad. With me is Leonard. This is a show about wrestling. And this week we are going to be covering one talent in particular. And as a matter of fact, a year in the period of his very long career. And that would be Greg Valentine and his stint in WCW. So let's go over some basics about Mr. Valentine. He was born Jonathan Anthony Wisniewski, September 20th, 1951, and he has over 5 decades held more than 40 championships, which include the WWF Intercontinental Championship, the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship, NWA World Tag Team Championships, WWF World Tag Team Championships, and on and on and on. And he is the son of wrestling legend Johnny Valentine. And I did not know this until we started researching this, Leonard, but he actually at one point went by Johnny Valentine Jr.
Oh, I don't think I knew that either.
Yeah. And his brother-in-law is Brian Knobs. So there's a lot about Greg Valentine that maybe we didn't know. I'm disappointed, Leonard, that he wasn't born Greg the Hammer Valentine. I was hoping that would be the case.
Including the hammer on the birth certificate, like his middle name is the Hammer.
Yeah. I don't know. So, yes, he was with Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. He was with Worldwide Wrestling Federation. He was, of course, with WWF and a lot of different companies. But most people listening or watching this are probably most familiar with his WWF run, where he was the Intercontinental Champion, Tag Team Champion, and had some feuds with Tito Santana and Ronnie Garvin, as we've talked about on a previous episode. And so that's where I first learned about him. Now, you know, I'm probably different in that when I first heard about him than you, Leonard, but it was probably around the WrestleMania 5-6 area that I first really have my earlier memories of him. When he was in the Dream Team with Brutus Beefcake, I was a little bit young to really recall that happening live. So, Leonard, when did you first discover Greg Valentine?
Well, you're right. I'm a couple years older than you, so I do remember the Dream Team tag team, but very briefly. I think it was at the very end of that run that I remember him at. So I primarily remember him as a mid-card singles wrestler. Didn't think much of him. Of course, as a kid, wasn't a big fan. And then from there, the tag team, they have the Honky Tonk Man, Rhythm and Blues, where he dyed his hair black. And I know that Honky Tonk Man has always jokingly called it Rhythm and Snooze. You mentioned the video that we did with Ronnie Garvin. And this makes a good compliment to that, because Ronnie Garvin spent a brief amount of time in WWF, and he feuded with Valentine during that period. And and we talked about how that Garvin didn't necessarily fit the WWF style and characters at the time. And I don't think Valentine did either. And that's why he wound up working with Garvin. But he was a staple of the 1980s nonetheless. I always think of Valentine as someone who kind of got grandfathered in. Like, he was there already, and Vince just kind of kept him and worked around him more than anything during that period. And and I was going to say this during the summation, but you did mention his own career. I've met Greg Valentine a few different times, autograph shows and indie shows and things of that nature. And the astounding thing to me is that Greg Valentine today, at the age of 70, looks about the same as he did 40 years ago. So, I mean, saying that at the age of 30, he looked like he was 70. And, he wrestled a style that I think, and I'm not bad mouthing him, because if I was going to make a list of the 100 greatest wrestlers of all time, I think Valentine would be on that for me. I don't know where. I'd have to really, sit down and do that. But he wrestled a style, and I think we're going to get into that as we talk about some of the matches from this era of 1992, is he wrestles a style that I would call him an old school all-arounder. He can brawl a little. He can technically wrestle a little. He can power wrestle a little. He doesn't go to the top rope. He rarely goes outside. I mean, he may bail to the outside, but he's not going to fight outside. And so he's got a style that is very old school and a style that you would think would fit WCW better than WWF at the time. But as we see, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, there were some changes and different things going on with WCW of 1992.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you were saying there. He was, pretty much a mid-card guy, but I think before the 91 Rumble, like the 91 Rumble was really where I started to appreciate his work. That was the Rumble that he lasted over 44 minutes in it. And the commentary of Greg Valentine by Gorilla Monsoon and, Jesse Ventura and Bobby Heenan, like, I think helped him a lot, really kind of laid out what type of wrestler he was, in that, it takes him a while to get going and he has a certain type of a style. And that's what the commentators did that really, I think, helped him become a name that people still talk about. Obviously, his work in the ring is part of that as well. But I think an understated part of his legacy is how well the commentators talked about him. And his style is very old school, very deliberately paced, not slow, because I think he does something, everything he does has a meaning and makes sense, but he goes at his own pace and it really suits his body frame and his speed through the match. And, I think that type of style is missing these days, where it feels like, they have to go really fast through a match and, have to do 50 million things. Whereas Greg Valentine didn't do that. Like, he would tell a story in the ring, as most people who have a submission finisher would do. Yeah. So I was a fan of his. Even though he was a heel, I always appreciated his work. But he would kind of play hopscotch in companies, throughout his career. And we'll talk about that here, because we are focusing on his 1992 stint in WCW. But before we get there, we have to talk about how he left the WWF. Now, Greg Valentine has done shoot interviews, so he has spoken about this out there. I, don't want to be too critical of the interviewers that I've seen, but like, at least in one case, they would ask Valentine some leading questions like, oh, you left in 92 because the gimmicks were being cartoony, right? And so, of course, he said, yes, that's why, which is totally not the whole story. Anybody who's listened to podcasts out there with some of the guys that were around back then, Bruce Pritchard or Jim Ross, whoever, is that in 92, the WWF was really full steam ahead with the youth movement. And the youth movement would not have included Greg Valentine. If it didn't include Randy Savage, it certainly would not have included Greg Valentine. So that's part of it too, I believe. Obviously, the gimmicks then were very cartoony, and I'm sure that was part of it. But as his interviews have kind of told me, when he starts to move down the card and lose on a fairly regular basis, maybe to people he doesn't feel he should be losing to, he tends to jump ship and leave for greener pastures. So I think there was a lot of that in it as well. So he did go to WCW in 1992, and he made his debut February 4th, 1992 at a house show in Norfolk, Virginia. And this kind of started his teaming with Terry Taylor, who at that time was known as the Tailor-Made Man. So we'll take a pause there, in that I just want to say in his WCW run, this was my favorite part of it. Now, I don't know if Leonard agrees. He had teamed with other people as well, as we'll talk about, but I think he and Terry Taylor, odd as they may seem, I think that they made a good combo. They became the United States tag team champions and had some pretty okay feuds with the Freebirds and, some of the others that were around back then. But Leonard, do you remember this little stint of his? Because I'll be honest, before this was suggested as a topic, I did not realize or remember that Greg Valentine was in WCW. I mean, around 92, I was not watching a lot of wrestling back at that time for many reasons. So I didn't even realize he was there. I mean, it was less than a year. So.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching the product at the time, but I can't say that I remember much of Valentine in WCW during actual 1992. I have, of course, now that I've got the network, I love watching like random episodes of WCW Saturday Night or what have you, and have seen Valentine then. So when this came up, I was like, yes, I was vaguely aware that he was there, but again, not so much from the time period. And let me say this as we work into 1992, is I've always thought that WCW in 1989, that is my favorite year ever for any company. And as good as they were then, that's how bad I think they were in 1992, or what you would call the Flairless era. Flair had left at that time, was working for WWF, and WCW during this period was just throwing a bunch of random crap at the wall to see what would stick. And the answer wasn't much. You mentioned Valentine not being part of a youth movement. He was 40 at this time, 40, 41 during this period. And he shows up and he's put into this random tag team with Terry Taylor, who I don't think there's any prior connection there with. And they win the U.S. tag team titles within a couple of weeks of being together over Ron Simmons and Big Josh, who are another slap together tag team.
Right.
And they feud with, you mentioned the Freebirds, a great tag team, of course, but also another feud they have was with Marcus Alexander Bagwell and Tom Zink, a slap together tag team. And it should be mentioned that Bagwell Zink, like, that's not a tag team you talk about with Buff Bagwell, who's been with all these different teams. That's one of the few teams he was in that didn't win gold, didn't win belts. So that should tell you a lot right there. And then as soon as Taylor and Valentine drops the belts to the Freebirds, they disappear. And I know we'll go through what happens next with Valentine. So what I think, this is definitely the high point of his run in WCW, tagging with Terry Taylor and winning the U.S. tag belts. And I think Taylor and Valentine do hook up pretty well. While I mentioned before Valentine was an old school all-arounder, I think you can say that about Terry Taylor as well, even though for the time period he was a little more modern than Valentine,
right,
and was a little bit more of, I don't know if we want to call a high flyer, but more athletic and more agile and more flexible than, say, Valentine. So to me, the best tag teams aren't where you get two guys who are the same, but where you get two guys that can complement each other. So on paper, definitely, I think Valentine and Taylor make a good pair.
No, yeah, I agree. And to mention again what you were talking about with leaving WWF and the youth movement, when you mentioned how old he was, you got to put that into context. I mean, there's a lot of talent out there now who are much older than that and can still go. But at that time, Vince was kind of moving away from some of those guys. I mean, as you mentioned, 92 is the Flairless era. So he was up there, and, Hogan was still around, but like that, would kind of drift downward, pretty soon. So I think, even more than the youth movement, I think for Valentine, I think that he was just kind of being left out in the cold, so to speak. I think that there was, with Flair there and some of the other names like Sid, Justice, I think at that point, that's what his name was. But there was a lot of talent there. And so I think that some people have to get pushed down as a result of those big.
And it should be mentioned too that during that late period, Valentine had turned face, and he is not a natural face. And I think that was just them trying to do something different. I don't remember the whole deal, but I believe it had to do with the split between him and the Honky Tonk Man and leaving Jimmy Hart and all that. So I think that had a lot to do with it as well. We don't know what to do with Greg Valentine. Let's turn him face. At least that gives us some fresh matchups. But the man's not a natural face.
Nobody with that face could be a baby face.
Yeah.
He has a rugged and, brawler type face and body frame. And that's a compliment, by the way. Like nobody, like, it would be tough to make him like a good guy in any way. But
Mhm.
anywho, maybe a tweener, but that's about the extent of it. So yeah, after he and Terry Taylor would, as Leonard mentioned, had feuds with some various slap together tag teams. He would on February 15th, 1992, that would be his debut on television, and he would 2 weeks later defeat Ron Simmons and Big Josh with Terry Taylor to win the United States Tag Team Championships. They would defend the belts against people like Zank and Bagwell on house shows, and at Wrestle War 92, they would lose to the Freebirds, and that was a pretty decent match, I would say. I'll be honest, I am not a Freebirds fan. I'm just not. I like Terry Gordy. I think Terry Gordy is outstanding and one of the greats in the ring. I'm just not a big fan of them without him for sure. But we can get into that on another episode.
I definitely think so, because there's a really big difference between the original version of the Freebirds and the WCW version of the Freebirds. But yes, that's a whole other avenue.
Absolutely. So yes, at Beach Blast, Valentine would kind of be, single at this point. He would defeat Marcus Bagwell. And you know what? On paper, if you had told me, hey, you got to watch this match between Greg Valentine and Marcus Bagwell, I'd be like, oh, God. But you know what? I thought it was pretty decent. It wasn't great, but like it was, for what it was, I thought they both did hard work in the ring. And then after that, he would kind of get involved in a feud with Dusty and Dustin Rhodes, where he would confront them on WCW Worldwide, and it would end up with Rhodes attacking Valentine, only then to be retaliated on by Dick Slater and the Barbarian with Valentine. So that feud kind of went on for a little bit, and this would kind of lead into him teaming with Dick Slater, who, they would wrestle against people like Barry Windham and Dustin Rhodes and the Freebirds. At Clash of the Champions 20, it would be Dick Slater and Greg Valentine. Greg Valentine and Dick Slater against Bobby Eaton and Arn Anderson, which is a heel versus heel match. And it wasn't very long, but, those four guys, I enjoyed watching it. So, Leonard, what did you think of any of these matches if you did see them?
Well, the first thing, again, Slater and Valentine put together, slapped together tag team, two guys. Why not? But one thing here is they had the mix with Dusty and Dustin Rhodes, and then that kind of had Valentine and Dustin feuding. I would have liked to have seen Valentine versus Dusty. Two veterans that could totally hold up your undercard with good promos and at least competent matches, if not super exciting ones. At this point, I think Dusty and Greg both had a sense of what they could and couldn't do in the ring, right, and could make that work. So I would very much would like to have seen that as a feud. Now, as for the matches that you're talking about, I don't believe I watched any of those, because I think those from pay-per-views. I was seeing what I could find on YouTube, and there are a bunch of Valentine matches from YouTube during this period, including some others with the Freebirds, not the one where they turned the belts over, but a significant one that I think really kind of defines Valentine during this period is versus Brian Pillman. And because Pillman, that one caught me immediately, because like you said with Marcus Alexander Bagwell, because he was not buff at this time, was on paper you go, well, that doesn't fit together. And that's what I was thinking with Brian Pillman. Well, that doesn't fit together. But you watch the match, and it's basically very interesting how Valentine gets Pillman to work his match, but still allowing Pillman to do Pillman things. Pillman uses drop kicks. Pillman is able to go into the ropes and shoot off and do body presses and things of that nature. But a very telling part of this match is that Valentine goes for a butterfly suplex, or a double underhook suplex, called so by Jim Ross. And he goes to do it, and instead of taking him over, he just kind of flips him up and drops him with a slam with a look of, that's good enough. And I think that's very much, this is a period, and we're going to talk about this next, I assume, is that Valentine was getting, I think, fed up. And you mentioned this earlier, when he starts going down the card and he feels like he's not being used properly, that is when, he kind of loses interest. And I saw that in this match, and I watched a few others. Another one was him against Big Josh. And you get the sense. So I think the ones I watched were maybe the later period singles matches I was able to get to. And I think you do see, and again, I'm sure that's going to be the next segment, is how he began to slip down the card. And he was not putting in the effort that you saw earlier on when he was in these tag teams and in these meaningful feuds and having, title matches and belt runs with, the belt run with Terry Taylor.
Yeah, and that Pillman match was very interesting. If people want to check that out, they should, because it is the only match I can think of that ended with a count of 5 rope break.
Yes, yeah. Bill Alfonso is the referee.
Yeah,
and I love how he eventually catches Greg full on. Greg doesn't let go. He tries to pry the legs apart for a second. Can't do that. Tries to get his arms off the ropes. Can't do that. And he just kind of counts him out and calls for the bell, and still won't let go. It takes Ron Simmons and Dustin Rhodes coming out,
right,
to get him to break. I'm sure it has happened, but that is one of the rare times, at least, that I can remember that being a thing. What I remember doing is Ric Flair would do that all the time, and Tommy Young would just kick his arms.
right.
And I was waiting for Bill to kick him, because of Tommy Young, which never happened. But yes, that's an intriguing finish there.
Yeah, it's very much an oddity in this stint. And you mentioned his match against Big Josh. So, Leonard, do you prefer Big Josh or Doink?
You know what? The original heel Doink, as played by Matt Bourne, is an interesting character, and I would definitely say is better than Big Josh. And I think, and I didn't know this as a kid at the time, I don't think I found this out till much later, that Big Josh and Doink were the same wrestler, at least Doink to start with.
Yeah.
I think I've read and I've heard that Big Josh, aka Matt Bourne, wasn't necessarily into that character at the time. And again, that was a character which, if you watch WCW television, got bounced around a lot. He would get pushed a little, he wouldn't. He was hanging out with Ron Simmons a little bit, and then he wouldn't. And again, as I said before, they were throwing every dart they could at the board, and nothing was really sticking, and they didn't know what not to do to make it work. This is really a down period for the company overall.
Right. Yeah. And, you can find some of the televised WCW matches that Greg Valentine was in. Unfortunately, not all of them, but, there's one where it's like it's a 6-man Valentine, Dick Slater and Barbarian versus Ricky Steamboat, Barry Windham, and Dustin Rhodes. That one's on there. And as I said, on the Peacock Network, you can find the pay-per-views and the Clash matches that I mentioned. But after that Clash 20 tag match, Valentine would be in a house show feud with Van Hammer and was undefeated. He would continue to team with Dick Slater against the Steiner brothers. I really wish that one of those matches would have been on TV, but those were only house shows. And on October 11th, 1992 of WCW Pro, he was defeated by Shane Douglas. And that was his last big match. Towards the end here, he lost to Shane Douglas and he lost to the Z-Man, Tom Zink, which is, that you can understand why this might have been like the straw that broke the camel's back. Yes. It's like, where am I going to go if I'm losing to the Z-Man?
And what does it say about Van Hammer? That Van Hammer was the only guy he could beat during this period.
Right. And, at the same time, though, the way he chose to leave and the hill he chose to die on, so to speak, is in retrospect, I don't think was a wise decision. So I mentioned it was October 11th, 1992 of WCW Pro that he lost to Shane Douglas. On October 19th, the taping of WCW Saturday Night, he arrived to learn that he was supposed to lose to Sting at that night's taping. And instead of losing to Sting, he resigned because, and you can hear this in one of his shoot clips, he didn't think Sting was all that spectacular. So he didn't want to lose to Sting, which I find weird. I just find not wanting to lose to that. I can understand leave. Here's the thing. If he had left when he lost to Z-Man or Shane Douglas, I would have been like, okay, I kind of get that. Maybe he should have just done business, but I can understand why you're not going to have much direction by losing to those guys. But for Sting to be the one that you're like, oh no, I can't lose this. To me, that's even then I would say that's weird. In retrospect, it looks even worse. But
well, even at that time, Sting was at the top of the card, right, and was starting to transition into being a seasoned veteran. He had been pro for more than 5 years by this point, and had been the world champion and all at this point. And I wonder if it wasn't just the fact that he was booked to lose against Sting, but the fact that, from what I've read, it was, you're going to lose against Sting, and who knows? Like, they didn't necessarily have him booked the following week, didn't know what he was going to do the following week. Right. I think Sting versus Valentine would have been interesting. I think Sting versus Valentine could have been a hold me up kind of feud if they were trying to figure out what to do with Sting next type of thing. I think that would have been interesting. And I think if they would have went to Valentine and said, here's what we're going to do. We want you to lose this thing, but you can attack him afterwards. We're going to maybe do a TV feud, let you guys work a couple weeks on TV. I think he would have been more into it. That's just my guess, that he would have been more into it. Because as you said, if you look at the other people Valentine was losing to, a loss to Sting doesn't hurt you. It shouldn't be a deal breaker.
Right.
So I think it was maybe possibly more. I think it was, we didn't have plans for you. Even on the losing end of, say, a mid card Sting feud, hey, you're gonna, because they used to do that back in the day, that they would have these kind of, the major feud, and then maybe like a minor, hey, we're gonna work with the guy for 2 or 3 weeks on TV just for doing it. Something like that, I think, would appeal to him. But I'm sure today, having met Greg, as I said, just a couple of times, minor in passing, that he would probably stick to his guns, that no, I wasn't going to lose to Sting, and that's where I left. But yeah, I and it could have been, as you said, just the culmination of it. I lose on week 1, I lose on week 2, I lose on week 3. Doesn't matter who it is, I'm losing, and you have no idea what to do with me next. That might have been the culmination of it.
Right. And it should also be mentioned in the same shoot clip, he mentioned that the person in charge at WCW at that time was Bill Watts. Bill Watts was the one that wanted him to lose to Sting. Mm-hmm. And, there are notorious stories about how talent did not get along with Bill Watts and really maybe didn't like his leadership style. And I'm sure that played a part in it. Who knows how he and Valentine got along, if they did at all. So after this, he would go back to WWF for a short stint, 93, 94. He would be one of the Knights in the Survivor Series with Jerry Lawler's team. And then eventually he would go back for a short time to WCW in 96 to 98, being used primarily on TV against Savage, the Giant, Lex Luger, people like that. So there wasn't really much notable that was going on with him in WCW at that time. I think it was just primarily to get a paycheck. And he said that, the most important thing for him was the money, understandably so. And he's just one of those consummate journeyman type of wrestlers. And I don't know for sure if his legacy would have been much more improved had he been more consistent, but it could have been. If he had stayed longer at certain companies and didn't play hopscotch as much, there is a possibility that, his legacy would be a little bit different. But he chose to go at his own speed. And when he got tired of something, he was like, okay, I'm out. And, he doesn't shy away from admitting that. So, I always liked Greg Valentine's work. I think that he could be a help to some of the guys today in terms of match pacing and psychology as well. But then again, I'm not in the business, but that's just what I see as a fan. So Leonard, what do you think? My final thoughts here on Greg Valentine's 92 WCW run.
Well, first of all, from what you just said, I don't think Valentine would necessarily have the patience to work with guys today. You know, some people
That's true.
are good players, as it were, but
Yeah.
they make lousy coaches because they can't
Yeah.
explain how they do what they do, or they don't have the tolerance to tell someone who is stupid, and I'm making air quotes for the listeners on the podcast, as opposed to those watching online.
People said that about Bobby Eaton as well. That
Yes.
like he was great in the ring, but he couldn't tell people how to do what he did.
Yes, and I know he did work for as a trainer for a bit for OVW, you know, because Jim Cornette was there. So yeah, I think that would be the point where I don't think Greg would have the tolerance or the patience for it, and I think it would be if it's not him in there doing it, he doesn't necessarily care. He's always come off as a bit gruff and rough and mean. And you know, one thing that we haven't talked about, because we haven't been talking about Greg's entire career, but that dog collar match that he had with Roddy Piper in 1983. That is an amazing match. That's one of the best matches of all time. I highly recommend anyone to watch it if they have not.
Absolutely.
That was from, I believe, Mid-Atlantic. And I think if Valentine, as you said, if he had not WWF, but Mid-Atlantic, or had transitioned to what became WCW, what was known as NWA at the time, Georgia Championship, et cetera, et cetera. I think I could definitely see him having had at least getting to the U.S. title level, having held the U.S. title, maybe being moved into a tag team at some point and holding either the U.S. tag belts or the heavyweight tag belts, a TV title run maybe later in his career as well. And again, you get that with consistency. You get that with you being there.
Right.
And his longest stint, I don't know, I would guess that his longest stint was probably that mid-'80s stint with WWF. I would really
absolutely, yeah.
And do the math, but that was probably where he was at the longest. And he did have an IC title run during that period. He did have, significant feuds during that period in the mid-card. Again, as I said at the top of the show, I would make Greg Valentine one of my top 100 wrestlers of all time. Where I would put him, I don't know. I would have to do the list. He's probably on the second half of that 100.
Go ahead and do that. We'll wait.
Yeah, we're not going to do that tonight. That might be an anniversary show, or do 10 a week for a while, or something like that. 15 a week. 100 would be a marathon episode. Anyway, 92 WCW, to sum it up, I think was just a real roller coaster ride for him, as it was for the company. He seemingly had more wins than losses, if you look, but those losses came towards the end.
Right.
He didn't seem to have much singles value. A lot of those losses came when he was a single. He was primarily used in tag teams, but again, it was with Terry Taylor and Dick Slater's and guys who didn't necessarily have a history with him, or maybe necessarily didn't fit him as a partner 100%. And this was a period too where WCW was picking up some other guys. Iron Sheik was one during this period who was there very, very briefly. I think he was maybe right before this, like 91. But I think there was an idea, and I read this with the Sheik, is that they thought they were getting the Sheik from 20 years ago. Not the Sheik from the 72 Sheik, not the 92 Sheik. The idea might have been similar with Valentine. But as we said, Valentine in 72, 92, 2022 is basically the same guy. He might be a little heavier and a little older and a little slower.
So there you go. You mentioned the weight. So that's what I was going to say. His style doesn't change much, but his appearance, I think by the time he got into 92 WCW, you could tell that he had started to put some weight on, a little bit more so than when he was in his prime. But yeah, you're right. I mean, his in-ring work didn't really change much to that regard, but
those guys of that period, you can tell the later era is they get that like not barrel chested, but barrel gut.
The beer gut. Let's just be honest about it. It's the beer gut.
It's not necessarily floppy, but it's kind of it's protruding. There's a lump there around the midsection.
They're working out, but they're still going to the bars after each show.
And you get to an age where your metabolism is not going to burn that off so much. I mean, if you look at like Don Morocco, case in point, mid to late 80s Don Morocco in WWF looks nothing like the dude that broke into the business. That man was an Adonis.
Right. Yeah.
If you go back and you can find old footage of him when he broke into the business. Late era, like early aughts Lex Luger, after he like WCW folded. I mean, and Lex today, of course, is sad to see, but but the period after where he really, let the body start to go. Those are always very interesting matches for me to watch these guys who were in such tremendous shape at one point, later eras of their career. Again, Jim Duggan, never super in shape, but you can make a flip book like Jim Duggan by the years, and the only difference is the gut just comes out more and more.
Yeah, I mean, him Mid-South Jim Duggan is not the Jim Duggan you grew up with in any way, shape, or form, yes. Maybe except for the beard. But anyway, that's a tangent. I would, if I were recommending matches for anybody to look at for this period of Greg Valentine, I would say the Pillman match simply for the ending, because it was just weird to see. But in terms of in-ring execution, I would say the Wrestle War 92 against the Freebirds, that was a good match for both teams. And unfortunately, a lot of the matches that he did in this period on TV are not on the Peacock network now because, well, it's terrible. But, if you wanted to look at the WCW Pro and the WCW Main Event and the WCW Saturday Night type stuff, not all of it's on there. Some of the episodes are on there, but not really for Greg Valentine's year. So that's unfortunate, but you can find a handful of them on YouTube, as Leonard mentioned. But yeah, this isn't the most memorable period of Greg Valentine's career, but it is worth mentioning, where his mind was and kind of why he went there. And if it draws people's attention to some of these matches, then that's cool. So, right, Leonard?
Right. That's what we always try to do is tackle things that necessarily other podcasts or webcasts don't tackle, and to maybe get people interested in an era or a wrestler or a company, et cetera, that maybe they weren't necessarily interested in before. And mostly of what I like to call the old school or retro wrestling era. And there's me with the air quotes again, watchers.
Well, that will about do it for us this week. I know Leonard's going to go order his Big Josh shirt here. But for Leonard, my name is Chad. We will see you next week, and Alexa will see you out.